Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone to the International Holocaust Remembrance Day lecture and panel discussion at the University of Colorado Center for Bioethics and Humanities. I'm Malia Himber, the outreach lead at the center and the program manager for the Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics program. The Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics program produces two annual sets of events, the annual lecture and panel discussion on International Remembrance Day, as well as multiple events during the National Days of Remembrance for Victims of the Holocaust. On the last page of the digital program you received, you'll see a save the date for our April 6th program, featuring keynote speakers Susanna Sirkin from Physicians for Human Rights and Rebecca Carter-Shard from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I also invite you to join us on February 8th at noon for the fourth installment of our Intersections of Race, Class, and Health lecture series, which features artist Daisy Patton, who will be speaking about her exhibit, Put Me Back Like They Found Me, which showcases portraits of immigrant and Latino women who were forcibly sterilized in the United States at a California hospital in the 1970s. Before we get to our featured presentation, I'd like to thank the advisory group and the program planning committee for this event, especially Dr. Jerry Lazarus, Dr. Ed Goldson, and Dr. Mark Levine, as well as my colleagues David Weil and Heather Clough at the Center for all their work in planning the program, along with our partners at the AMA Journal of Ethics, who also helped organize and co-sponsor this event. In addition, I'd like to thank our panel co-sponsors, the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust, the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics, the Lancet, the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics, and the Indiana University Center for Bioethics for their participation, as well as our many donors, large and small, who contribute to the Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics Program Fund. I'd now like to introduce our first guest of honor, Dr. Regina Richards, who is the Vice Chancellor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus, and Dr. Richards will be giving a few opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Malia. Thank you to everyone who has invited me to be here today. I'm very honored to come before you today on this day of remembrance, the Holocaust. One of the most horrific occurrences in our history, slavery being another. 6 million Jews and millions of others murdered, genocide. At the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, with the United Nations General Assembly, Article 2 states, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or part a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. Basically, exterminating whole populations. Children, adults, homosexuals, women, socialists, communists, trade, unionists, Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses. Let's fast forward to today. Structural racism still exists. Systemic issues of oppression, discrimination, marginalization, acts of violence and omission, based on power and privilege, on identity, on bias and control. We must continue to learn from the lessons of and the legacy of survival, unity, systemic change, and equity. Much will be talked about today, and much of how we remember and what we remember from the Holocaust. I am honored to be here with you today, to remember, to commit to continue change, systemic change, and to be a partner in this work. Thank you so much for the honor and the privilege of being here. I will turn it back over to Malia.
Thank you, Dr. Richards. It's an honor to have you here with us today. Our next guest of honor is Dr. William S. Silvers. Dr. Silvers is a clinical professor of medicine, allergy, and immunology, and he is the founder of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics Program Endowment, in addition to being the son of Holocaust survivors. Dr. Silvers is going to give a few opening remarks, and then he's going to introduce our featured presenter for today's program.
Thank you, Malia. When Matt Wynia came to Colorado from the AMA in 2014, the CU Center for Bioethics and Humanities blossomed. In addition to his many callings and hard call podcasts, he has recently been on the front lines of pandemic ethics and crisis standards of care in Colorado and nationally. Matt has worked with the senior historian at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to develop teaching materials on the legacy of health professionals' involvement in the Holocaust. Whereas I came to Holocaust bioethics as a physician whose parents were survivors of concentration camps, Matt engages as a non-Jewish physician, feeling that there is no aspect of modern medical ethics that has not been affected by the Holocaust. Dr. Wynia is the director of the CU Center for Bioethics and Humanities and professor in the School of Medicine and the Colorado School of Public Health. He is a past president of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities and has chaired the ethics forum of the American Public Health Association. He has served on expert panels and as a reviewer for the Institute of Medicine, the Joint Commission, the Hastings Center, the American Board of Medical Specialties, federal agencies, and more. He has published more than 150 articles, actually 189 to date, chapters, essays, and is a contributing editor for the American Journal of Bioethics. More recently, he co-edited this month's AMA Journal of Ethics, dedicated to the legacies of the Holocaust in healthcare, in which we have a call to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day, January 27th, in all health science schools. January 27th, the liberation of Auschwitz. Well, I inherited the Holocaust. Matt relates from the ethos of a physician to remember and teach its lessons to our and future generations. I thank Matt and all those committed to this mission with him. It's an honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Matt Wynia.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Apparently I was muted for a moment there. Can someone just, Malia, Bill, someone nod to me if you're seeing the right slide? Or are you seeing
We are seeing your title slide.
You're seeing the title slide. Okay,
We were, it just went away.
Okay, I will go back to that. Okay, are we good?
Yeah,
Yes.
it looked good.
So Bill said that this was a talk that was largely developed between me and the senior historian at the Holocaust Museum, Dr. Patricia Haber-Rice. And I want to acknowledge, number one, that she's on the line, so she's going to hear pieces of this talk that will sound like they are coming straight from her, because they are. I've learned an enormous amount about this legacy from Patricia, and I want to start with a quote that I take from her, which is that this is a story. This is a story about medicine, and specifically about medicine mishandled as state policy under a notorious dictatorship. Patricia has also said that there is no part of this history that is perhaps less studied or less well understood, or perhaps more oversimplified than the history of medical crimes and of medical practice under Nazism. And Perhaps the reason for this is because it is so comforting to think that health professionals are always a force for healing. The traditional ethics of healthcare cast physicians, nurses, dentists, pharmacists, all of us as beneficent healers. And our classical injunction is we cure sometimes, relieve often, comfort always. And so it is comforting to think of our ethics as being timeless, immutable, as being natural to our work, as though the values underpinning our profession are stable and enduring since the time of Hippocrates. And yet, as we all know, these core values were profoundly shaken in the 1930s and 40s when medical professionals took on leadership roles in the Nazi regime. Nurses, physicians, dentists, pharmacists, all not only participated, not only were complicit, but often led some of the most terrible crimes of the Nazi era. A few were prosecuted at the medical trial at Nuremberg, pictured here. Most were never held to account. And yet, as Bill noted, this history profoundly influences every aspect of the ethics of the modern profession. I defy you to think of an ethical dilemma today that is not in some way colored by this history, whether it's triage in a pandemic, ethical issues in genetics, racism and health equity, the beginning and end of life, the ethics of cost control, access to care. All of these are viewed through the lens of medical crimes of the Holocaust, even when we don't realize it. Before I jump to the story, and the slide is blank on purpose because I want to just say a couple words personally about this. This is the talk that I give every year to the students on our campus, and it is by far the most difficult talk I give. And I give a lot of talks about controversial topics. I like to say if it's not controversial, it's not ethics. But this is different in two ways, one personal and one professional. And I think Bill already mentioned the personal aspect of this, which is, you know, many of the people listening give lectures, and you know that when you give a lecture, there's always a chance that someone in the audience will know the subject better than you do. But in this case, there are people, several listening today, who own this history in ways that I never will, because I am not Jewish, nor am I German. I have no direct familial connection to this history. And yet, if there's one thing I've learned from my work with the museum, it's that obligations of remembrance fall to us all. This is our shared history. For me, this is not about Jewish history, or it's not just about Jewish history. It's about understanding the story of our profession, how we got to where we are today and where we're headed. I also think it is unfair for obligations of remembrance and learning from this history to be borne only by its victims. I believe all health professionals need to understand and, in a sense, to own these historical events. And that gets me to the second way in which this is a very difficult talk. It is really hard to take any contemporary lessons from this history. If I make any direct comparison between Nazi doctors and a contemporary ethical issue, I will be accused of playing the Nazi card, and I will more likely close minds than open them. And I think there is some truth to that accusation, right? That as shocking as anything we might talk about today might be, nothing is going to come close to intentionally infecting a young girl with typhus and then waiting until she dies and then killing her healthy twin so that you can dissect them both and compare their organs, right? There is nothing happening today that is comparable to that. And yet, somehow, we have to be able to learn from this history. So I'm going to start by asking all of you to open your minds to learning from our profession's role in the Nazi regime, and to recognize that because it was so heinous, this history is prone to oversimplifications, heroes and villains, but these are oversimplifications that divert us from learning lessons and subvert our vigilance. So the question implied by the title of my talk is, how did healers become killers? But I'm going to make a more stark claim than this. I'm going to make the claim that although we will never know what might have happened if health professionals had not taken on the leading roles that they did, I believe without our professional involvement, the Holocaust itself might never have happened. And obviously, Hitler didn't need doctors to generate his anti-Semitism. So this may seem like an outlandish claim, but I just want to say I am not the first to make it. Dr. Andrew Ivy was a medical ethics expert sent to the Nuremberg trial by the AMA. I also want to say there's nothing in his quote here about Nazi medical experiments in the camps. And I just want to put this on the table because I'm not going to talk about medical experimentation, even though that's the piece of this history that most of you are most likely to have heard a lot about. And that's because Mengele and others of his ilk who conducted these experiments were what Dr. Haber-Rice calls criminals of opportunity. They wanted to do experiments. They had human beings in front of them on which to experiment with no apparent consequence, no matter how unethical their experiments might have been. But as evil as their actions were, those doctors who carried out the experiments were not, by and large, the leaders in creating the conditions that allowed them to carry out those experiments. And it's those other doctors whose story I want to tell, in part because their story starts long before the Holocaust, and it starts outside of Germany. In fact, the story starts as far back as Plato, who talked about eugenics as a means of improving the ruling class in the Republic. He said eugenics, in essence, is the idea that you can use selective breeding just as you would to create a stronger ox or a faster horse. You can use selective breeding to create a better human being. And if you do it often enough, you can create a better human race. So the basic principles of eugenics, as sort of most famously laid out by Francis Galton after Darwin published On the Origin of Species in the mid-1850s, this coincided with rediscovery of Mendelian genetics and an emerging understanding of cells and chromosomes, and really created this sort of rebirth of an interest in what Galton dubbed eugenics during the progressive era in medicine in the US and nationally. And there are basically two approaches. There's positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is about defining certain people as being more valuable and then supporting them to live healthy lives and to reproduce. Negative eugenics is about defining those who are not valuable and then marginalizing them. Or if you think they're seriously risky to the genetic pool, to the nation's stock, if you will, you might prevent them from marrying each other, prevent them from breeding. And this process of defining groups requires, in a sense, the concept of race, of course. And it is in that regard about race that implementing negative eugenic policies had been developed well before the 1930s and mostly outside of Germany. In particular, US laws that defined racial groups like the one-drop rule and so on, and anti-miscegenation laws preventing intermarrying between so-called races. These were prominent examples that the Nazis very much took to heart. In the early part of the 20th century, so again, long before Hitler comes to power, many people hoped and hypothesized that the use of eugenic ideals and ideas would have applicability across all of society, the sort of idea of social Darwinism. So Karl Pearson, whom you'll recognize as the namesake of the Pearson chi-square test, he was an English mathematician And he believed genetics was destiny. His two books were incredibly influential. The Grammar of Science in 1892 was the first book that Albert Einstein assigned as required reading for his Olympia Academy in 1902. And Pearson argued that stronger races ought to conquer weaker ones. And by the way, I highlighted on the right-hand column here, the idea of the so-called Aryan race as being superior is well established in 1901 when Hitler was 12 years old. The international movement, again, not primarily led by Germany, but primarily led by the US and England, but also France, Japan, others, had some important German leaders like Ernst Rudin, who would become an infamous Nazi. But you'll recognize some of the other famous names on this list. Charles Davenport was a prominent and also controversial American eugenicist who ran the Cold Spring Harbor and its eugenic record office, for example. And the findings that were presented at this first international conference were particularly notable for, at least in a current reading, in a modern reading, for this notion of feeble-mindedness, congenital feeble-mindedness or hereditary feeble-mindedness. And Professor Punnett, some of you will remember Punnett from high school, Punnett squares. Punnett thought that if only you could prevent feeble-minded people from having children together, there would be no such thing as feeble-minded people within a generation or two. An American Conference on Race Betterment is also held at around this time in 1914. It also has a number of luminaries. Harry Laughlin is going to be of particular note here, since he would go on to write a model law that would promote forcible sterilization of people on eugenic grounds. But also Booker T. Washington, which I see as an indicator of just how appealing the theory of eugenics was. My friend and colleague Paul Root-Wolpe has said eugenics was an elegant theory because it provided answers for so many different social issues. This was widely talked about at this time. This is a little announcement that I came across at a used bookstore a few years back. From 1913 and 1914, you could have the AMA send someone out to speak at your local medical society meeting. And here's the one for Colorado, and you'll see that you could have Dr. Corwin come and talk about race hygiene and eugenics, and how eugenics was going to save society from, using the language of the time, feeble and degenerate stock. This whole book is just covered in people giving talks with similar themes. And in the US, there were a number of laws promoting sterilization of people against their will for eugenic purposes that were passed over about a 30-year time frame, including in many states, not including Colorado, by the way. Colorado is listed as not having a law, but that does not mean forcible sterilizations were not carried out here extra legally. In fact, there is at least one very well documented case of this happening in our state that is highlighted in the exhibit that Malia mentioned at the beginning. So like the racism and the ableism that sort of inspired these laws, they did not all disappear after World War II. My original home state of Oregon carried out its last forcible sterilization in 1981, the year before I graduated high school. North Carolina's law was on the books until 2003. These laws were supported by the US Supreme Court in the infamous case of Carrie Buck versus Bell. Carrie Buck was to be sterilized because she was ostensibly feeble-minded. She was not, but she became pregnant, probably from being raped by the nephew of the family she was living with. But her mother was institutionalized, apparently for an intellectual disability. And then her newborn baby was judged to be feeble-minded as well. So Carrie, her mother, and her baby were the three generations in the famous quote from the last line. But I've highlighted the sentence above that line as well, because this shows how US forcible sterilizations were entirely framed as public health and the idea of preventing genetically ill people from harming the rest of society. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. So when Hitler comes to power in 1933, one of the first laws he passes is the Law for the Prevention of Progeny with Hereditary Diseases. This orders the forcible sterilization of people with certain afflictions. It's based on Harry Laughlin's model law, but it's even more aggressive. The categories are basically taken from the California law. But over about 70 years in the US, we sterilized about 65,000 people against their will. The Nazis were much more aggressive. In just a few years, they would sterilize about 400,000 people in a much smaller country. And by the way, these people are sterilized, that's a separate number from those who are sterilized in experiments in the concentration camps and elsewhere. So the question is, how does the state find individuals to sterilize? And the answer here is, first, doctors, dentists, and nurses and midwives are all required to report their patients. Second, there are referrals from directors of hospitals and mental institutions, but also directors of prisons and workhouses and so on. And third, it was not uncommon for people to be denounced by other citizens, their neighbors, their employers, even their family members. And what happens when someone is denounced or is recommended for this? Well, there is a due process, just as with the American system. Once a proposal to sterilize someone is received, it goes before a special hereditary health court. Each of these has 2 physicians and 1 judge. And over the 1930s, there are over 250 of these hereditary health courts established across the country of Germany, operating in parallel to the regular German judicial system. If the decision is for sterilization, the person then has 4 weeks to appeal. Otherwise, the sterilization has to take place within 2 weeks, and it would take place even if force is required. Some of the people sterilized had significant mental disabilities and other disabilities, but many of them were captured under this ambiguous category of hereditary feeble-mindedness, because this is what allows for the sterilization of vagrants, of prostitutes, of women with children out of marriage, petty criminals, truants, and so on. I want to say, by the way, these are not primarily Jewish people being sterilized. They are ethnically German, but they are people who are similarly thought to pose a threat to the racial purity and to the genetic purity of the German stock. And the Germans were very well aware of this. This image on the left shows a poster from Germany saying, "We are not alone," and looking at all of the other countries of the world that also had forcible sterilization type programs in operation at the time. The next step on this path seems almost obvious. If you think genetically inferior children should be avoided by forcibly sterilizing people, what do you do when a genetically inferior baby is born anyway? And Karl Brandt was Hitler's personal physician. He would be the chief defendant at the Nuremberg trial. So his words here, which are spoken at the trial, should be taken with a giant grain of salt. He lied frequently. But he described a baby born to a family named Nauer in the winter of 1938 in Leipzig, who was blind, missing 1 leg, missing part of an arm, and was, in quoting Brandt here, an idiot, or at least it seemed to be an idiot. And the Nauers reportedly petitioned Hitler to allow a mercy killing of this child. So Brandt went to look at the child, and what I've highlighted here is the piece of this that is so disturbing, because Brandt essentially thought it would be cruel to leave a decision for mercy killing in this instance to the parents, and that doctors should make this decision and protect the parents from it. As the war nears, this experience leads to more calls for the elimination of unfit elements from German society. So the first mass murder program of the Nazis was called the Child Euthanasia Program, and it precedes the final solution, the Holocaust per se, by about 2 years. Notice I put euthanasia in scare quotes here because this is not euthanasia, right? This is not children or their parents seeking a gentle death. This is a cynical, secret program of mass murder where physicians, nurses, midwives are required to report newborn infants children under the age of 3 who show any signs of severe physical or mental disability. Their parents then receive a letter requesting the child be sent to a so-called special treatment center. When the children arrive, they would typically be starved to death, or they would receive an overdose, or sometimes they would be killed by a direct injection of phenol to the heart. But the parents would not be told this. They would be told the child was doing well. Then they would be told the child had taken a turn for the worse, had developed pneumonia, and that the child had died, all to camouflage a program that was clearly illegal under German law. This program expands from infants and toddlers to children up to the age of 17. And conservative estimates are that at least 5,000 children were murdered by doctors and nurses at about 30 or 35 specially designed or designated children's killing wards that were established around Germany. And again, the next step from this seems obvious. If you are killing disabled babies, what about adults living in institutional settings with disabilities? So by 1940, an adult killing operation paralleled the program to murder disabled children. This was codenamed Operation T4 for the name of the central office address in Berlin on Tiergartenstrasse. The T4 program used the practices developed for the child program. Questionnaires went out to the public health officials, private hospitals, public hospitals, mental institutions, and so on. These forms were designed to look like they were just gathering statistical data about, for example, which of the patients were so severely ill that they could not work. And some doctors purposefully exaggerated their patient's condition, thinking it might keep them from going to a work camp, but instead it marked them for death. These so-called registration forms would be reviewed by 3 specially appointed medical experts. Many significant academic physicians in Germany played this role. People selected for euthanasia were first confirmed then by the central office. Then they were transported to one of 6 killing centers located throughout Germany and Austria. These killing centers were located inside existing hospital and healthcare facilities. On their arrival, the patients would be led into specially designed gas chambers that were disguised as showers. They would be gassed to death, then their dental gold would be removed, and their bodies would be cremated in specially designed crematory ovens. And if that all sounds familiar to you, it should, because the technologies later used at mass killing centers like Auschwitz, as well as the camouflage techniques that could get someone to walk right into the gas chamber, were developed and perfected in the T4 program. This program was also secret. It was also illegal. Official records of these deaths were always falsified to indicate that the victims had died a natural cause. But it quickly became an open secret. Articles were even written about this in the United States. Ash would cover the towns where these facilities were located. Parents reportedly warned their children not to misbehave or they would be sent to the hospital. And there were some religious leaders in Germany who started speaking out against the mass murder of the disabled. And Hitler, we're now in the war years, so Hitler is a dictator running a terror state, but he does still care about public opinion. And in the summer of 1941, he personally gives an order to halt the T4 operation. But that does not mean the euthanasia program goes away. Instead, it's diffused across Germany. It's still choreographed from Berlin, from the central office, but local authorities now get to determine the pace of the killing. And instead of gas chambers, they use drug overdoses and lethal injections and starvation, like in the child program, because that's a more covert way of killing. And this takes place at hospitals all over Germany. The same hospitals would have normal operations, and at the same time, sometimes in the same ward, there would be patients formally marked for death, and the same doctors and nurses would be aiming to heal some, but kill others. By the end of the war, about 200,000 people were murdered in Operation T4. And in the meantime, during this euthanasia pause, when it moves from 6 localized sites to being diffused across the country, there are over 100 people who had become reliable operators in running an illegal program. These people were clearly inured to the killing process, and they had the medical and technical expertise necessary to carry out mass killing. One of them is shown here, a man named Johann Neumann. He worked first on the left for the T4 program, but then during the T4 pause, he is transferred to help build and run a new set of death factories, the killing centers of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. So the forcible sterilization program, then the killing programs targeting disabled children, and then disabled adults are directly connected by ideology, by technology, and by theories of eugenics to the wartime program of mass factories for genocide, the Holocaust. All of these programs are grounded in a racist ideology, often using policy ideas originally borrowed from the US, and all were framed as medical and public health programs with the aim of creating a master race. So let me turn now to trying to understand the German medical community a bit better. And I'm going to start by talking about medical ethics. Given what it became, one might assume German medicine before the Third Reich was in the ethical dark ages. But one of the great ironies of the Nuremberg doctors' trial is that at the time, in 1946, prosecuting attorneys went looking worldwide for formal ethical guidelines to govern human subjects research. They found 2 examples. Both were German. In the 1890s, a Prussian physician named Neisser, the discoverer of Neisseria gonorrhea, intentionally infected orphans and prostitutes with syphilis to test treatments. And in response to the public outrage that followed, the Prussian minister drew up ethical guidelines for research, which in 1931 are adopted by all of Germany. These call for the unambiguous consent for the subjects of research, human subjects of research. Medically, scientifically, pre-Nazi Germany was also more advanced than the rest of the world. Following the American Flexner report, the German model of clinical education had become the worldwide standard. In the decade before the war, Germans and Austrians won half of the Nobel Prizes in medical sciences. Germans invented the electron microscope. The one here was the Siemens company microscope, which was used to identify asbestos particles in lung tumors, which gets us to public health and epidemiology, where Germany was also the world's leader. For example, this slide shows one of the first large-scale surveillance projects, charting the incidence of different cancers among smokers and among non-smokers. They used this science to promote things like mass screenings for cancer and other diseases. This is a German ad from 1936 asking women to examine their breasts to detect breast cancer at an early stage. This is decades before similar public awareness campaigns in the US. The Nazis urged women to avoid alcohol and tobacco during pregnancy. Again, far in advance of similar public health measures in other countries. And the Nazis barred smoking in public places. Note on this, by the way, the African-looking head on the cigar, because Nazi anti-tobacco activists tried to characterize smoking as sort of a vice of degenerates. And I use the term degenerates intentionally, right? Because that's about genetics, about genes, about race. So the pre-Nazi German medical profession was not backward ethically, scientifically, or in public health. If anything, what set the profession up may have been its tremendous success, leading to pride or hubris in the scientific arena. German physicians became convinced that they could use medical science and public health programs to create a master race. And the idea here is if the state wants a fit population, it should work to improve the health of those who are desirable and eliminate from the population those deemed unfit. And when you open the question, who is unfit, you turn to doctors. So German physicians developed these elaborate genetic and racial maps of disease, which have two explicit uses: to promote healthy breeding and to eliminate undesirables. So this is a marriage counseling image saying the precondition for a good marriage is the health of the body and the soul. These good marriages are to be supported, but undesirable marriages, you can see on the bottom, you'll be turned away and you'll leave dejected because of perceived genetic or racial risks. You're not allowed to be married or to reproduce. Similar, by the way, to the anti-miscegenation rules, the Nuremberg race laws look very similar to American race laws, except that American race laws are actually more, they're more aggressive in the sense that the German definitions of who is in the Jewish race are more lenient than the American definition of the one-drop rule. So this thinking is driven by racist ideology and ableist ideology, to be certain, but it is at the time promulgated and believed as science. By 1933, all German public schools and all doctors were receiving training on heredity and race. So this is an image from a high school biology textbook, but note that it has very little to do with biology. Instead, it promotes the ideology of eugenic cleansing through an appeal to concerns over national resources. So looking at people as useless eaters or as costly to the state was important politically, but I want to make a different point. It also brought physicians to conceive of the German state as a body, literally a body politic, one which could be ill as a result of an impure genetic pool. And this vision of Germany as a body politic with its pseudo-scientific underpinnings is what leads to the final solution. This is an image from 1935 that illustrates this step. It says, Adolf Hitler, doctor of the German people. And under this ideology, Jews would be described as cancers or as an infection. This is a quote from Hitler speaking to the German Doctors Association. And it's preceded by him saying something like, I don't really need engineers, I don't need lawyers, I don't need anyone else but you, doctors. I can't do this without you. Without you, all is lost. Dr. Ernst Rudin in 1933 would say that doctors were to be responsible for, quote, the preservation of healthy hereditary elements and eradication of pathologic elements in German society. So I asked at the outset, how did healers become killers? And one answer is that they transform into a group in pursuit of national goals rather than protectors of their patients. These are perverted, racist goals, but they are cloaked in science and public health, and doctors endorse them with very little dissent. In short order, about half of the doctors in Germany became Nazis voluntarily. Many reasons have been given for this. All of them probably hold some degree of truth. There was this belief in eugenics. There was a desire to be national heroes. There was the defeat of Germany in World War I and the economic devastation that followed. So there was an oversupply of doctors at this time. There was physician unemployment. There were large numbers of Jewish doctors who were competing for limited jobs. And there was the takeover of the independent German medical associations by the state. So the German Commissar of Physicians, a man named Gerhard Wagner, in May of 1933, so this is well before the war, orders the dismissal of all Jewish physicians from committees and boards of directors of the two major medical societies. And this was done, he said, quote, with the advancement of German medicine in mind. Outside the German Jewish community, there were really no protests of this. And this is the cover of the first issue of a new journal that was the combination of two previously independent journals. So by October of 1933, more than 5 years before Germany invaded Poland, JAMA reported that a German federal chamber of physicians would be formed that would take the place of all prior independent physician associations, which would be disbanded. Again, no significant protests ensued anywhere. In the summer of 1933, JAMA had also reported on the German forced sterilization program, where physicians were required to turn in their patients without regard to patient confidentiality, and many US physicians supported these policies. There were some protests against the forcible sterilization program, as there were in the US, but these were disturbingly rare. And it was a physician, again, Gerhard Wagner, who first proposed the eugenic euthanasia program to Hitler in 1935. He proposed it as a public health measure. The first commandant at Treblinka was a physician. Treblinka, by the way, is the camp to which the Warsaw Ghetto is evacuated. Over 900,000 people would die at Treblinka. The leaders of Poland's death camps had largely been trained in the T4 program, and the T4 program itself came straight from the belief in the German medical practice law after 1938, which said, it is the duty of the medical profession as a group to preserve and promote the nation's health, sound heredity, and racial purity. And the imagery and language of medicalized killing becomes a key part of the Reinhardt camps. Take, for example, the killing pits at Treblinka. This is not a photo from Treblinka. There are no photos of Treblinka that are known to exist, but it does represent a typical execution pit. And Treblinka was built in a rural area, and it had a reception space where cattle cars are unloaded, so it looks like a legitimate train station with clocks and timetables and posters. And it has a door that looks like it's to an infirmary with a red cross over it. But in fact, the infirmary is no more than a facade disguising the entrance to the execution pit, where prisoners are murdered who are too weak to march even to the gas chambers. Records show how medicalized the killing was, with people being described as the patient was cured with one pill, meaning killed with a single shot to the head. From here, it's not hard to see medical personnel administering the final solution of mass death by gassing at other extermination centers. This is perhaps the quintessential image of the role of the physician, ramp duty at Auschwitz, which all medical personnel, physicians, dentists, pharmacists, had ramp duty on rotation, during which they selected people destined for the gas chambers and those healthy enough for forced labor or other cruelties. And of course, because the gas was dangerous, physicians were required to supervise administration of Zyklon B in the gas chambers. There is no record of any physician being punished for refusing to perform ramp duty or any other duty at the concentration camps, but very few refused. It has become common to say the Nazis viewed Jews and some others as subhuman, like animals. But I'm going to show you two images now before we close that are perhaps the most telling examples of how this is not actually the case. It was worse. And it was worse because it was based in notions from medicine and public health. So first, you might be surprised to hear one of the first proclamations of the Third Reich was to bar vivisection. So this says Heil Göring, vivisection forbidden. And it has the lab animals of Germany saluting Hermann Göring, because in August of 1933, he announced an end to the, quote, unbearable torture and suffering in animal experiments. And he threatened to commit to a concentration camp anyone who still thinks they can treat animals as inanimate property. So given the subsequent treatment of Jewish people and others by the Nazis, one might wonder, what are Jews that they could be considered even less worthy of respect than a lab animal? And here's the answer. The title reads, Infectious Germs. The symbols are those for Jews, communists, and homosexuals. Here, the scientific gaze of the microscope looks down onto the petri dish of society, completing the biological state metaphor. Here, people have become pathogens. So let me close by returning to where I started with obligations of remembrance. Here you see a curator at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., preserving memories, in this case, shoes. In an exhibit that brings the reality of genocide closer to the viewers, most of you whom, like me, have no direct familial connection to these events. Sarah Bloomfield, the director, has said, our museum is unique. It's about responsibility. Our responsibility to the past and to the memory of the victims and survivors, our responsibility to our fellow human beings in the present, and perhaps most important, our responsibility to future generations. So what is our responsibility? How do we learn from these deeply perverted and traumatizing events? The classic answer to this is that the Nazis prompted us all to address questions of consent in research, but while there's no doubt the Nuremberg Code was a central event in the so-called birth of bioethics, it was not until considerably later than the Nuremberg trials that the rest of the world started to take consent seriously. The AMA sent ethics experts to the Nuremberg trials, but Andrew Ivy rapidly realized that he was going to need written rules for human subjects research, and the AMA had none. So he ran back to the AMA, and in December of '46, during the trial, the AMA publishes rules for human subjects research, which comprise these three little points. So the result of this is that the hastily drafted AMA research guidelines and the Nuremberg Code were largely ignored afterwards because, after all, they were written for Nazis, not for Americans. So there was a researcher at Harvard Medical School who said the Nuremberg Code was, quote, conceived in reference to Nazi atrocities and was not necessarily pertinent to or adequate for the conduct of medical research in the United States. Another said the interpretation of these codes was that they were necessary for barbarians, but not for fine, upstanding people. And so we had to wait for public revelations of research abuses in the US, like Willowbrook and Tuskegee, before we created in 1979 ethical rules for the conduct of research that were, and in fairness, are today taken very seriously. But in this sense, continuing the syphilis study at Tuskegee was a result of US physicians' inability to learn from the lessons of the Holocaust, because we saw German doctors as monsters, not human beings. Other current examples of relevance include public health campaigns, the ethics of genetics. And here I think it's important that we articulate key differences between then and now. So the principle of not harming one population as a means to help another, the central role of the doctor as protector of the most vulnerable among us. Issues of racial and ethnic health disparities also draw from this history, but again, it's worth emphasizing that our approach today is the opposite of the philosophical orientation of the Nazi doctors, right? We see racial differences in health status and seek to raise up those who are disadvantaged. We're clearly far from where we need to be, but work on health equity today is different and better because of this history. And finally, given the events of the last 20 years, I can't talk about this without acknowledging the difficulties of dual loyalties for physicians, especially during wartime. We always have to balance obligations to communities and to individual patients, but in wartime, it becomes, or for that matter, any sense of tremendous urgency as the current pandemic, it becomes easier to rationalize harming individuals in service to national goals. And the Nazis knew this, right? Hitler's physician, Karl Brandt, said, quote, "The Fuhrer was of the opinion that killing Jews and others would be easier and smoother to carry out in wartime." So our professional ethics must carefully gird against the inevitable pressure to use our medical skills to harm captives during wars. And maybe most importantly, this history drives home why our codes of ethics must be living documents. You don't just learn about these once and then walk away. They're things we have to continue to talk about and debate over the course of our careers. This is my last slide, and I'll just say, I'm not going to read this, you all can read it, but I will add that if we cannot learn from this history, our ability to protect against these crimes or lesser versions of them is diminished. Because what that means is that doctors today, and again, not just Jewish doctors, all doctors all around the world, need to understand that the German medical profession of the 1930s was not alien or otherworldly. They were world leaders in medicine, in science, in public health, even in medical ethics. Because what this means is that the question for the medical profession today is not how did a few monsters crawl up from the depths into our midst. We have to struggle to understand how did most doctors in the most advanced industrialized nation in the world become murderers together, and not despite their training, but in the name of science and public health.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you everybody for submitting your questions in the chat. We have almost 600 of you, so we do have quite a few questions, and we are gonna have to get to our next program. But Matt, I think maybe you have time for one question?
Sure.
Okay.
I apologize, I should have had a clock out here.
That's okay. So this is actually going to combine from two people's questions on contemporary ethical issues today related to this history. So one is, can you speak a bit on how the principles of eugenics have had persistent effects on healthcare disparities today? So healthcare disparities today, and then also a related question is about what can we learn from this history and rationing of limited medical resources with COVID today, and how can we learn from this to better protect our patients?
Well, so as you know, Malia, we did an entire hour-long program on the connections between this legacy and the ways in which we think about disabilities today, and the impact of that on triage protocols. So I think there are a number of ways in which triage protocols today are being developed explicitly to avoid, not always perfectly, so I don't want to defend every triage protocol that's been written, but I will say it is uncommon for a triage protocol today to be written without explicit attention to the well-being of people with disabilities. And I do attribute that to this legacy, the fact that, and by the way, to research subsequently that shows that we still have a tremendous amount of stigma around disabilities in the medical profession. And then with regard to racial and ethnic health disparities, I think, you know, I sort of hammered a little bit on the extent to which the Nazis looked at the racialized policies and programs that we developed in the US in order to maintain structures of power and privilege, and that still exist to, you know, to a lesser extent, but they still exist to some degree today. Those are the same structures that create the disparities that we see in healthcare access and outcomes today. So, you know, things like redlining, things like anti-miscegenation laws, these are structural features of American society. And even when they only exist for one generation or two generations, they have many generations of subsequent knock-on effects, right? So if you look today at the number of African Americans who become doctors, it is much smaller proportionately than it ought to be. And the reasons for that are because for generations, we prohibited essentially most African Americans from being able to get into medical school and to practice and to receive advanced training opportunities. Again, there's another, a career could be spent looking at these interconnections, but they are inextricably interwoven.
Thank you so much. So for those of you who submitted questions, we may be able to get to some more of them during the panel. We will also be sharing all of them with our planning committee and our presenters, so please keep them coming. Right now, we are going to take a short break, just 2 minutes. So if you want to grab a beverage or use the restroom, now would be a good time to do so. And then we'll be back with Dr. Ali Kao, who will be introducing the panel discussion, Challenges and Opportunities in Teaching the Legacy of the Holocaust. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll be right back.